this morning can be found on page 1083 of the Church Bibles. John chapter 15, verses 1 to 5. The vine and the branches. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If a man remains in me and I in him, he will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. This is the word of the Lord.
Morning. Well, here we are again. Just keep your fingers in the Bible passage, because I will be referring to it, and it helps that you can keep an eye on that if you so wish. So previously I was talking about Jesus' declaration that he was the light of the world. And I was talking to you about what that means in a little glimpse of its fullness about light. Some of you said it was too intellectual. Thank you. It's the first time anyone has ever said that to me. so I do thank you for that. So that was last time. And then last week Mark was talking about the mark of disciple, about making the choice with your faith, about making decisions to believe. And here we're hearing again from Jesus as he comes back to make another outlandish statement. Maybe not to us now, but at the time it was an incredible thing he was saying. Where Jesus is saying that God is the gardener, that Jesus is the vine, and that we are the branches. And there is a lot in this. There's a lot in these 5 short verses. But this morning, I'm going to focus on 3 key words. See, theological college, you get it, 3-point sermon. Okay, so you're going to, the 3 key words are fruit, prune, although prune is a fruit, we're using it in a different context, and remain, a word that you may or may not be sick of hearing. But let's look at some of the context here. So the Bible is always kind of multi-layered. Reading it is difficult at times because of so many things, because you've got to consider the lenses that are in place. You've got the lens of the author, why they're writing it, who they're writing it for. Then there's the actual situation at the time that is going on. And then there's us in our context, years later, reading through those lenses. But let's try and place ourselves in the immediate context right now. So the scene here takes place after Jesus has washed the disciples' feet. And after he has used some bread and some wine as symbols for his body that was to be broken and his blood that was to be shed for them and for the whole of humanity. Jesus is in the middle of explaining to the disciples that he's going to go away to the Father. And then he quite abruptly says, "Come, let us leave." And then we're into this bit. So just preceding that, he's talking, all this has happened, he's saying all of that, and then he says, I'm going to go to my Father, I won't be with you. Come on, let us go. And then they're going to walk, and they're walking up to Gethsemane. Because this is the night of Jesus' betrayal. The most important single event in the history and future of all humanity is imminent. So this is the climax of the most important event that will ever take place. And that's where we find ourselves when Jesus starts talking here. This is the seventh of Jesus' I am statements. And as I said last time, he used it intentionally, the words I am, and forcefully, because that is how God introduced himself to Moses. So he uses I am statements, and they're all connected to something at the time. And as Mark said rightfully, I think, that if it was Jesus now, he would be using things that we are familiar with now, whether it be Wi-Fi or other such things. Because he did it here with his I am statements. After the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus said, I am the bread of life. After a festival that celebrates and uses light as an illustration, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. As they were looking over fields where the shepherds were with their sheep, Jesus said, I am the gate, and I am the good shepherd. Just before Jesus brought Lazarus back to life, he said, I am the resurrection and the life. And then when Thomas is exclaiming and saying, but how can we possibly know the way, Lord? Jesus said, I am the way. And he gives him two extra bonus I ams, the truth and the life. And on this walk, they're going up to this garden where Jesus is going to pray, and they're having a chat or whatever, but we can imagine that there'd be vines on the way, because in this particular part of the world, that was not an uncommon thing. It still isn't. And they would have seen vines, and there may have been vines in the garden. But Jesus uses these simple, everyday, familiar objects to illustrate his point. And here he says, and I am the true vine. And he may say true because in the second time he says he doesn't use the word true, but he may say true because Israel had often associated itself and been used in imagery as a vine previously, as the vine. So everything comes from God, comes through them, and they're the vine. So Jesus says, but I am the true vine. And there is so much in this morning, in this text, but this morning we'll be focusing on these three words. The first is fruit. So fruit is an important theme of this scripture. Branches, that's us, are connected and attached to the vine. They are part of the same thing. They're as one. And that's what faith tells us. And oftentimes in church, and if you've been around church long enough, you'll hear people talk about having a personal relationship with Jesus. And I think that's where this has to start. Having a personal relationship with him. And people often say to me that don't know, what does that mean? To have a personal relationship. And I'm going to I'll give you a short illustration. So in the in May 2014, I played football in a cup final at Hague Ave, which is in Southport, and we're a Southport District Cup final. And I was sitting on the bench. I can't believe it myself. But I was sat there on the bench, and we were 1-0 down. Cup final, we worked hard all season for this. And the crowd, I could hear the grumbles in the crowd. There was a roar of, get the chubby lad on. Well, all 200 of them. And the manager looked at me and he was like, Sarge, come in. So I got Kate was there, she'll verify all of this. She was the one shouting it. So he gave me the note and said, go on. I think there's about 20 minutes left. We're 1-0 down. Season was coming to a failure. First touch landed on my chest. Second one landed in the back of net. 1-1. I don't want to brag, but we won 4-1. 2 goals, 2 assists. And we won the cup anyway. That was just a little bit for myself. But in September, there was one day and there was a young lad who must have heard about this. Because he came to me and he says, can you help me? I want to know about how you score goals. How you do that. So I said, yeah, so I gave him a bit of advice. And I've got a photograph of the lad here. So this is me and this 18-year-old boy. Right, if you follow me on social media, you'll be aware that this is an 18-year-old Cristiano Ronaldo. So that is a photograph of me. I was going to put it on the screen, but my hair is so bad I didn't want to distract you. As David's already commented on Facebook. But that is me and Cristiano Ronaldo in there. And I can tell you loads of things about Cristiano. Not only how he learned to score goals, and it's not all down to me, but a mention would be nice. But he was born on the 5th of February 1985. He was born in Funchal in Madeira in Portugal. I can tell you about some of the great things he has done. I can tell you about, I've even witnessed some of the amazing things that he's done. But I know about Cristiano Ronaldo, but I don't know him. As much as I don't want to admit it, he probably doesn't have a copy of this photograph on his telly. I'm not in relationship with Cristiano because he doesn't know me. And it's the same with us with Jesus. It's not just knowing about Jesus or what he's done or some of the stories. We need to know him. And not just know him, because we need to be in a relationship with him. As we know him, he knows us. And here he is saying, I am the vine. And if a vine is of good quality, then the branches should bear good fruit. And Jesus is the ultimate vine. But the branches have to be fully connected to the vine. If they're not fully connected, they won't bear fruit. And the branch will not be fed by the vine and won't get what it needs from the vine. And ultimately it will wither and die. Jesus reiterates this. He says, no branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. But how do we know if a branch is truly connected? By the fruit. But what is the fruit that we should be looking for? Galatians tells us about the fruit of God's Spirit. And it's not only this, I'm sure, but not the fruit of God's Spirit is only this, but I'm not sure it's not the only fruit from what can come from us. But the fruit of God's Spirit is this: love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That is the fruit that will be borne by a branch that is fully connected to the vine that is Jesus. If you look at the text, Jesus says that God, the gardener, cuts off branches that bear no fruit, which you may think sounds a bit harsh. But this is not the first time that Jesus talks like this. We don't always like to admit it, but Jesus talks quite frequently about judgment. So it says, if we look again in verse 2, he cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. So it's fairly clear, isn't it? Well, I'm not sure that it is. Because, and I know I joke about it, but when I went to theological college, I thought everything was clear. And in a couple of months, everything I ever believed was kind of unraveled. But I learned that everything falls into three categories in the Bible, it seems to be. That it's probable, it's possible, or it's plausible. But here it's saying that Jesus says that God cuts off the vine that is in him that bears no fruit. It's translated as cut off. And I know that your translations would probably say cut off too. But if we look at the verse more closely, it says, he cuts off every branch of mine. The NIV says, every branch in me. The Greek New Testament says, he takes it. And that's all it says. He takes it. And before I went to theological college, it used to be one of the things that I'd sit there and when people would talk about the Greek, I'd think, all right. And that's what I was like. But now, since then, I've realised it's a great tool, and sometimes it confuses matters. So here I go. The word takes here, which is used in the Greek, is the word aero, and it has 4 different meanings. So it says it cuts it off, but it can mean to lift up or to pick up. It can mean to lift up figuratively, as in, I lift my eyes to the hills. It can mean to lift up as to carry away, to remove. Or it can fully mean to remove, to extract. And I'm just suggesting here that maybe it means one of the other 3. Because grapes from the vine, they aren't like pumpkins and other fruits that will be fine on the ground. They won't develop normally. Grapes have to hang. That's what they do from the vines, and that's why they have trestles and other things when you're growing vines. Because the key here for me is that Jesus says, the branches in me that do not produce fruit. Jesus is making it very clear that the branches are in him. Later on, he differentiates and says, the branches that do not remain in him will be cast aside. But here he clearly says that these branches are in him. And here's the thing. There are branches on a healthy grapevine that will fall along the ground. They get covered with dirt, they're shaded from the sun, but they're alive. They're getting nourishment from the vine, but they're not producing fruit because they're not in the correct environment. They're shoots or branches that have been knocked off the trellis for one reason or another. And this is saying that the gardener comes along and takes them away. But I think it might be that the gardener comes along and lifts them up, washes them off, and puts them back onto the trellis in the right environment that they need to produce fruit. So in this case, the branch is restored, it's lifted up, it's trained, and it's put with other branches in an environment where it can produce fruit. Taking it slightly further, you could say that in lifting us up as branches, God puts us in relationship with one another because other people can help us to grow and to be more fruitful. Now that's for you to go away and look in and see what you think, but when you've got 4 possible explanations for one word, you've got to kind of choose one. It's just when I'm thinking about fruit, it doesn't sit really good with me. And again, fruit is often seasonal. It's not always constant. There's not many, if any, plants that are fruitful all the way through the year. So sometimes as Christians, I think we deduce for ourselves or for others that a lack of fruit is about being disconnected. But you may be in a tough seasonal environment, or you may have just fell to the ground and need God to pick you up. You may just need that because you're still connected, you're still hanging on, you're still choosing to believe that God is there. And let me tell you something else about fruit. Vines that are well connected, or branches that are well connected to a strong vine, they don't have to work really hard to bear fruit. They can't help it. They don't think, tell you what, I'm really well connected to this vine. If I concentrate really hard and do all of the right, put my branch out in the right way, I will grow fruit. Because they're connected to a good vine that is tended by a good gardener. They will produce good fruit. They can't help but produce fruit. And it's the same for us. The more connected we are to the vine, the more we will naturally, organically produce fruit. And that's it. And that's not an excuse to say you don't have to try. But what you have to try is to get connected to the vine. Don't try and produce fruit without being connected. Another thing that I think is that vines don't bear fruit for their own benefit. They don't go, I'll tell you what, I'm going to grow some grapes today. How good will these grapes be? They think, no, I'll tell you what, we'll have some grapes and then people can benefit from it. Animals can benefit from it. So when you're drinking your nice glass of Rioja next week or whatever, remember That the vine didn't have to work that hard, the branch, it was just connected to a good vine. And you benefit from that. The same with us, the fruit that we're producing, other people should be benefiting from that fruit. It's not for us to look and go, look how good my fruit is. People should be able to see that. People should benefit from the love, joy, peace, patience. Jesus then goes on to say, whoever does bear fruit will be pruned so that they are even more fruitful. And we can see pruning as a painful process. And I imagine that many times it will be. But it is always, unless you're in my house, it's always beneficial. Our house is the place that plants come to die. It's a true story. People give us a plant and I just feel bad. What they call them red Christmas flowers. I try and get one on Christmas Eve, see if I can still have it at Boxing Day. And gardeners amongst us will know better than I do about pruning, but ultimately it helps plants to grow and to be more effective. You can ask Kate again afterwards. I had a goat pruning the other week because some of the leaves on one of our plants were brown, just parts of them. So I just cut the brown bits off. Thinking, oh, well, I know it's bad. I'm thinking, it'll just be fine. But it wasn't fine. We have all kinds of different shaped leaves now. I thought I was pruning, apparently it was butchering. But in this, God is better than I am at pruning. God the gardener will cut away the parts of us that are doing us no good. The parts of us that get in the way of us producing fruit. Get in the way of us being fully connected to Him. And you may be able to identify situations and circumstances that are going on in your life. Things that you've been through or you've gone through now that get in the way of you being more fruitful. Things that maybe you need to cut away or ask God to cut away. I know that I can identify such things in my life. And this is not simply just an area where God is blessing us and helping us to be more fruitful. It speaks of a deliberate movement of God to remove something from us. Something that will make us more effective and fruitful. So that's pruning. The third and final word that we're looking at today, and I feel that this is the core of Jesus' message, is the word remain. And that's a word that we've heard a lot lately, over recent years. And although it has nothing to do with Brexit, right here, Jesus is campaigning for us to remain. He's campaigning for us to remain in Him. And I remember when I was a youngster, and this is getting more and more complicated as I get older now, to tell stories of my childhood and my parents. Just because the things that I'm kind of laughing about my parents doing, I find myself doing more and more often. But I remember when we ever used to go anywhere, particularly holidays. So we were going on holiday somewhere and the flight was 5 o'clock in the evening and the airport was an hour away. And I wanted to go out and do something. My dad would tell me to be back at a certain time. And he would say, Ian, we've got to leave the house at 12 midday. So I want you back here at 10. I'd be like, Dad, everything's done. Yeah, but we need 2 hours in case anything goes wrong. I don't know what's going on. I want you back at 10. So come back at 10 because at 10 o'clock we'll be all here gathered together and we'll have an explanation of what we're doing and I'll know where you all are at 10 o'clock. So don't forget 10 o'clock. What time do I want you back? 10 o'clock. Right, so at 10 o'clock we'll all meet. So he'd say it about 20 times. I'd be like, Dad, I get it. And that's a bit like what Jesus is doing here. He's not telling the disciples to be back for a time, but he's driving his message, reiterating it. And I find myself doing it when I'm trying to tell Kate, because something's important to me. I want to make sure she gets it. And Jesus is doing that here. He says in these 5 verses that we've read, he uses the word remain 5 times. In the following 3 verses, he uses it another 6 times. So that's 11 times in 8 verses. Quick maths. But why? Jesus says, remain in me. Which, if my GCSE English has taught me anything, it's that this is written and read in the active voice. If that's wrong, then my GCSE English hasn't taught me anything. But it means that the subject, which is you and I, at acting out the verb. We're doing that. It's ongoing. It is continual. To remain in. It's not something that is past. It's not something that we have done or we do once. To remain in him is an ongoing thing. Every day is a school day. But Jesus also focuses on the word in. To remain in me. He doesn't say remain close to me or alongside me, but in me. And then he promises that then he will remain in us. Because if you look at a vine and branches and look at the fusion between a vine and branch at the point where they connect, it's impossible to say which is joined to the other because they are both joined to one another. And I think that's what we should be aiming for in our relationship. We should be aiming to be so close that we can't really tell where one starts and the other ends. Here, Jesus is talking to his disciples. Disciples that know him. They have seen him perform miracles. They know who he is. They've declared who he is. They love him. They are connected to him. And they are bearing fruit. That's who he's talking to here. After a few ups and downs here, they're just about getting it right. And Jesus has told them that he's going to go away. He's going to his Father, that it's time for him to leave. And in this last time with them all together, until his resurrection, he says to them, he implores them to remain in him. He knows that without him there, they will be more susceptible to fear, temptation, doubt, distraction, and all of these could cause them to become fruitful and ultimately less connected. Jesus is telling them that it will be tougher than it has been because he will not be physically with them. And that they have to be intentional about remaining in him. And the same goes for us. We need to be intentional about remaining in him. It's that active voice. It's not just a one-time thing that we've done or made a decision or put our hand up in a meeting or said a prayer once. Discipleship is ongoing. We have to take responsibility for remaining in him. So just in closing, are we fruitful? Can we see where the fruit is evident in our own lives? If not, what are we going to do? Where do we need pruning? What is it that needs cutting away in order for us to be more fruitful? And what are we doing, individually and collectively, to remain in him? How are we being intentional about staying close to Jesus and deepening our discipleship? Amen.
We're going to spend